Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special session on mental health among teachers during this pandemic. My name is Bill Jones. I'll be moderating the call today and hosting. COVID-19 has obviously presented everyone with unprecedented challenges. Education has been profoundly impacted, with many teachers and students and parents are feeling very stressed and anxious and afraid, and that's what we're hearing from the field. Teachers have had to, of course, completely transform their instructional strategies, switching to online and then sometimes back and forth between in-person and online and face-to-face interactions have been very modified, needed to be modified because of safety requirements, which are top of mind, and a constantly changing set of protocols and health regulations. As ministries of education are also struggling with no playbook, continuously having to make decisions and respond to changes in the pandemic conditions, often giving schools and teachers very little notice and very little time to prepare for these shifts. It's been particularly challenging for band teachers, who are our audience today, whose instructional strategies have been typically based on very continuous interaction with and among students. I can think of my days as a band director walking through the band, for example, to reach the trombone section and help them out with something, which of course is not possible in these conditions. In addition, I think many of our teachers are feeling really a sort of a sense of a loss of pride, a loss of joy, and some of the rewards that come with performing for audiences, live audiences, participating in music festivals, band trips, and other things that have really been the mainstays of band programs. Besides those losses, teachers have lost much of their autonomy as professionals, as they need to comply with so many regulations that tend to limit instructional possibilities and performances. So in a nutshell, the threat of becoming ill, the demands of ongoing modification of teaching strategies with limited time to do so, and the unpredictability of what comes next really combine to create some serious challenges to teachers' mental health and wellness. Today, we have a couple of special guests with us to help us unpack these issues and discuss them. And in just a moment, we'll have them introduced. I also wanted to mention Tom Taylor, who's with us today. He's the author of the book, Teach Band 101, and the founder of this website. And it was his idea to include this as a resource for teachers. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Judith Law. She's the executive director of Anxiety Canada, and she'll introduce our expert panel today. Judith, over to you.
Thanks very much, Bill. I'm really delighted to introduce two members of our Anxiety Canada Scientific Advisory Committee. Our scientific advisors help us to develop resources on our website. They also are researchers, and they are some of the experts in anxiety and anxiety disorders in North America. I'll start with Dr. Stewart first. Dr. Stewart is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of British Columbia, and she's also a founding director of the Pediatric OCD Clinic and Research Program at BC Children's and Women's Health Center. Dr. Seles is a registered psychologist, and he is also with the provincial OCD program at BC Children's Hospital, and he also sees private patients at Cornerstone Child and Family Psychology Clinic. Both of them have been longtime advisors to our organization, and they are both leading researchers in Canada. Thank you.
Thanks for being with us today, Dr. Stewart and Dr. Seles. To begin with, I'm wondering if you could just maybe share some general observations, maybe things you've seen through your practice about how and why COVID-19 is impacting the mental health of some individuals.
Sure, I'll take the first answer here. So I think your preamble set it up really well, and you identified a lot of the reasons why COVID has been such a challenge for mental health. So one of those being that it involves a loss of control over many aspects of our lives in terms of sort of occupational control being one of the main ones, but also control over one's health and wellness more generally with this sort of ongoing threat, something that we're consistently messaged and told around as being dangerous and having to be vigilant to, and really not knowing, it's not, oh, you get sick within a day. It's these 2-week periods that leave so much uncertainty and so much potential for things to constantly shift and change. And a sense of control or certainty over one's sort of environment or future is something that is often really helpful for people to do well. And when that doesn't exist in the external world, you may be sort of searching for that or finding ways to try to control your life from an internal place. But often that's not necessarily possible. Your emotions come and they go. And so you get stuck sometimes in sort of these anxious processes or other sort of patterns that aren't so helpful for mental health. And then I think the other really big side of the coin is this loss of access to, whether it's the coping strategies that you had or the positive influences. You talked about for band teachers, the loss of the reinforcement in teaching that comes along with one-on-one interactions or band performances or things like that. And then in people's personal lives, whether it's being able to see their family members or spend time with friends or do, sports or other group activities that maybe normally they didn't think about as a coping activity, but really were ways in which that they took care of themselves and maintained their mental health.
I think that was a fantastic answer, but really I think really uncertainty is a huge driver for anxiety, this not knowing and having to tolerate the fact that there aren't concrete answers out there for exactly what we need to do to keep ourselves safe. We sort of have mixed messaging, and I think to have that sense of security, it's helpful to feel like you're certain about what's going to happen. If I do this, then this will happen. If I don't do this, then that can happen. But now we're just sort of not in this realm, and it keeps sort of changing over time. And there's also uncertainty about how long this is going to last. So I feel like people who may have been quite resilient initially, as the months go by, that we all get worn down a little bit in our capacity to just sort of keep going with the flow and keep trying our best and keeping shifting in this uncertain world, uncertain times. That's really challenging.
And to what extent do you think it's potentially compounded by the fact that teachers are surrounded by anxious students, anxious parents, anxious administrators? Does this make it worse? Or
I think for sure. So I think it's hard enough if you're kind of needing to worry about yourself and trying to make sure you're doing the right thing, or when it's not really clear what the right thing is to do. But then if you add on to this, if you're sort of in a caregiving role, that just multiplies things many fold. So not just your own personal worry about how they're going to do, but also a sense of responsibility of overseeing that maybe the kids aren't sort of crossing lines that they shouldn't be, for example. And again, coming back to the uncertainty, what are those lines, and sort of mixed messaging there. So yeah, I think it's just incredibly challenging. And then the debate around uncertainty and debate around how much should be permitted to do in person versus at home, and what are the risks to kids staying at home with social isolation versus a risk for kids going into school, and the risk for their caregivers. I mean, there's just a world of things to be concerned about. And I think if as a teacher, you have all of this regular interaction with just huge groups of kids and peripherally families.
Are there certain kinds of individuals who are more susceptible to mental health problems as a result of the pandemic, or pre-existing conditions that increase the risk?
When we look at mental illnesses or something such as anxiety disorders, it's pretty clear that they're multifactorial in terms of causation, meaning that there's many different things that sort of come together in play before a full-blown anxiety disorder will emerge. Part of that is genetics. So, everyone's born with something you inherit in your DNA. There could be vulnerability there. For example, for people, they may have anxiety disorders running in their family. They may be more vulnerable in a stressful time to have emergence of this kind of thing. Also, for people who are vulnerable with sort of pre-existing physical illness, or those who are vulnerable due to food insecurity or difficulty around housing, or in remote or rural areas where they may not have access to treatment or support. All of those things that can take away some resilience maybe put someone at a bit more risk. That's not to say for sure they're going to end up with what we would call an anxiety disorder, so that people are kind of overwhelmed and they're not able to function as well in their daily lives. But it increases the chances.
On the individual level, you have sort of certain patterns of thinking or belief systems or behavioral responses that may also influence sort of the susceptibility to this. So, for example, the extent to which someone feels really connected or fused to the thoughts that they have. For example, a thought that says, you might have contracted COVID today. Your brain might just come up with that thought, but if you sort of have this strong connection when that thought happens, that might produce a lot more anxiety and distress, which then might lead you to sort of some safety behaviors or difficulty. So those types of things can make some people more susceptible. And then others could be sort of their pre-existing patterns of coping. Are they someone who tends to avoid when stressful situations come up, or engage in strategies that tend to try to escape uncomfortable emotions or situations? Or are they someone who have generally, when that happens, have resources to turn to or have ways of getting through that? And I think, with a stressful situation, what you see is the more stress that comes up, often the more sort of people are driven to try to figure that out. And if the way that they typically figure it out is something that maybe amplifies that over time, they would be more susceptible to someone or to the distress than someone who doesn't have those patterns.
For people, they may have anxiety disorders running in their family. They may be more vulnerable in a stressful time to have emergence of this kind of thing. Also, for people who are vulnerable with sort of pre-existing physical illness, or those who are vulnerable due to food insecurity or difficulty around housing, or in remote or rural areas where they may not have access to treatment or support. All of those things that can take away some resilience maybe put someone at a bit more risk. That's not to say for sure they're going to end up with what we would call an anxiety disorder, so that people are kind of overwhelmed and they're not able to function as well in their daily lives. But it increases the chances.